Very good evening to all of you. My name is Nicholas Chong, and on behalf of the Aspect Foundation for Music and Arts, welcome, very, very warm welcome on a cold night to our concert this evening. The first half of our program tonight brings together two familiar names from 19th century music, the Russian composer Tchaikovsky and the German composer Brahms. And what is the most amazing thing about these two composers is that they actually had a chance to meet each other in person. In the year 1888, they actually had dinner together in the city of Leipzig. Now, I'll have a chance later on, a little more time, to tell you about this dinner event in great detail. But for now, I'll just give you a hint and say that their interaction was less than smooth sailing. And a lot of that might have had to do with just how different these two men were, not only in their backgrounds, but as I'll tell you about in terms of their musical outlooks. Brahms, to begin with, came from very humble circumstances in the city of Hamburg in Germany. This is a picture of the house that he grew up in. And his parents, though they were sort of upwardly mobile, also came from fairly humble backgrounds. His father there on the left was a local musician. He played mostly in local taverns and dance halls, and his lovely mother there on the right worked as a seamstress. Contrast this to a couple of portraits, this time of Tchaikovsky's parents, looking a little finer in terms of their clothing. Tchaikovsky came from a very well-to-do family in Russia. His father, for example, was lieutenant colonel in the Imperial Russian Army. So very different circumstances that he grew up in. And we can also see that from Tchaikovsky's childhood home, which I hope you'll agree, it looks a little less shabby than Brahms's was. In this home, Tchaikovsky was brought up by a French governess, and by the age of 6 was already able to speak French and German fluently, so had sort of a cosmopolitan outlook in his upbringing as well. Because he came from an upper-class background, to become a musician for Tchaikovsky was not considered socially acceptable. So from a young age, his family groomed him for a career as a government bureaucrat. This is a picture of the Imperial School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg, where Tchaikovsky was packed off when he was a teenager. He spent a number of years there. Just to give you a sense of the kind of social milieu that this school belonged to, this is a contemporary painting of what life was like for the students who attended this institution. Tchaikovsky graduated from this school. He eventually spent 3 years as a civil servant, as a government bureaucrat, before he somewhat bravely abandoned this career to pursue his musical vocation. But much more important than these superficial differences in terms of their backgrounds was that the two men, Brahms and Tchaikovsky, had diametrically opposed views of how to write music. So Tchaikovsky is this consummate romantic composer. For him, the priority was memorable, unforgettable melody, which leads to a kind of very direct, in-your-face, emotional expression. And he prized this emotional immediacy over any strict adherence to classical conventions and structures in terms of the musical tradition from the classical era previously. Brahms did care about things like melody, and he did care about things of like emotion, but Brahms thought of himself as a conservative, as a classicist, in fact, much more in the mold of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven of generations before. For Brahms, it was very important that a piece was logical, that it had a coherent structure, and he was into melody, but the biggest difference that you'll see, or that you'll hear rather, in the way that Brahms treats melody is Brahms never gives you the same melody the same way more than once. He'll state a melody, it might be a very memorable melody, but he'll manipulate it subtly as the piece goes on. Whereas with Tchaikovsky, he was much happier to compose a melody that you will remember, but keep playing that in a much more unvaried manner.